We're going to be delving into one of the key instruments of international human rights law, the European Convention on Human Rights, or the ECHR. And this session should give you some practical insights into how the ECHR protects individuals and shapes legal systems across Europe. So what is it? Well, the ECHR is an international treaty adopted in 1950 by the Council of Europe and then coming into force in 1953. Its main purpose is to protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals within the states that are members of the Council of Europe. So, why does it matter? Well, the Convention provides a framework for protecting rights such as the right to life, prohibition of torture, freedom of expression, and, as we'll focus on today, respect for private and family life. The enforcement mechanism that oversees this is the European Court of Human Rights. This is based in Strasbourg, which is in France. And this court hears cases from individuals, groups, even states sometimes, alleging violations of their rights under the Convention. The ECHR is very significant because it gives individuals the power to challenge their own countries for failing to uphold human rights. It's led to profound legal and social changes across Europe and raised standards for state behaviour and inspired similar systems globally. Let's consider this discussion prompt. Well, why international human rights? Why do we think international protection for human rights is necessary? Can't we just leave it up entirely to the individual countries? Well, international protection sets a basic standard for human rights everywhere, so countries can't ignore or weaken these rights. Sometimes local governments can't or won't protect certain rights, or maybe their laws might seem a bit unfair, and international oversight basically makes sure countries are held responsible. And it gives people help when their own country's system doesn't work. You might ask, are there even situations where domestic legal systems do fail to protect human rights? And yes, there are many examples. In some countries, minorities might be treated unfairly, maybe local laws might ignore or even support this. The existence of a supranational court, like the European Court of Human Rights, can really impact national laws and policies. It can pressure states to change, maybe to improve their laws and policies as well. So we're going to take a closer look at Article 8, which is the right to respect for private and family life. So we're going to zoom in, and this is one of the most far-reaching rights under the European Convention. It states that everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home and his correspondence. Let's break that down a little bit. Private life, what does that mean? Well, it covers aspects of personal identity, autonomy, physical and psychological integrity, sexuality, and the right to develop relationships. Family life next protects relationships between parents and children, married and unmarried couples, and sometimes even broader family members. Home, not just a physical house, but any place where a person lives or has significant personal connections. And finally, correspondence. Now, this refers to the protection of communications. That could be letters, emails, other forms, and includes privacy in prison or at work. Article 8 is often described as a qualified right, meaning it can be restricted in certain circumstances. But before we get onto that, let's see some cases, some of the rights in action. Okay, so here's some case studies here. First of all, we've got Pretty versus United Kingdom from 2002. So a lady called Diane Pretty, she was suffering from a terminal illness and wanted to argued for the right to assisted suicide as part of her personal autonomy and dignity. The European Court acknowledged that personal autonomy and the way a person chooses to live or end their life does fall under private life. However, the court found that the UK's prohibition was justified under Article 8, Section 2, and this permits restrictions for legitimate aims. Another key case is Marx v. Belgium from 1979. Now, this case centred on the rights of unmarried mothers and their children. So, Belgian law at the time, it made a distinction between children born in and out of wedlock, whether their parents were married or unmarried when they were born. And that impacted inheritance rights. And the court ruled that this was a violation of family life, and Belgium had to actually change its law based on that. Then we've got Campbell versus United Kingdom. Here, a prisoner's correspondent with her lawyer was intercepted by prison staff, and the court held that this interfered with the correspondence aspect of Article 8, and such interference must be necessary and proportionate. In this case, it wasn't. What about limitations on Article 8? Well, Article 8 protects your right to respect for your private and family life, but that right's not unlimited. Governments can interfere with it, but only if they follow very strict rules. So here's what those rules mean, and I'll explain them a little bit more clearly. So first of all, in accordance with the law. So any action by the government that affects your privacy must be clearly based on existing laws. So that means the interference can't be random, it can't be secret, it has to be something the law allows. And the law must be clear enough for people to understand what is permitted. Other limitations, well, legitimate aim. So the government can only interfere with this right for specific important reasons that are listed in Article 8, Section 2. So these include things like protecting national security, public safety, preventing crime, protecting people's health or morals, or safeguarding the rights and freedoms of others. So if the government's reason isn't on that list, then the interference isn't allowed. And then finally, we've got necessary in a democratic society, proportionality. Even if there's a law and a good reason, the government must show that interfering with your rights is truly needed. They have to prove that what they're doing is the least intrusive way to achieve their goal, and that they aren't going too far. So in other words, any interference must be balanced, must be fair, and absolutely necessary. So only go as far as is absolutely necessary. So for any restriction to your privacy or family life under Article 8, the government must follow those 3 steps. Act according to clear laws, have a valid and important reason, and make sure the interference is not excessive. Only what's strictly needed in a free and democratic society. So consider this real case, Halford versus United Kingdom. Mrs. Halford was a senior police officer, and she found that her work telephone was being tapped by her employer. Now, the court held that this was an interference with her private life and correspondence, and the government had to show that the interference was legal, for a legitimate aim and proportionate. And in this case, actually, the UK government failed to justify that interception under that criteria, and that basically then led to a finding of it being a violation. Let's move on to state obligations under Article 8. So there are 2 main types of duties under Article 8. And the first of these is negative obligations. So in this context, the word negative refers to the state's obligation not to interfere. So they're negative because then they shouldn't be doing anything. They should not interfere with your rights under Article 8. So in other words, governments must refrain from actions that would unjustly intrude on your private or family life, like, conducting unlawful surveillance or disclosing your personal information without a valid justification. Now, the emphasis here then, because it's a negative obligation, is on restraint. And this makes sure that the state doesn't overstep its boundaries and violate your protected rights. So, for example, not to conduct unlawful surveillance or to disclose private information. But we also have positive obligations of the state as well. So in this context, positive refers to the state's responsibility to take active steps to ensure that individuals' rights to private and family life are protected. So unlike negative obligations, which basically mean, hands off, that requires the government simply not to interfere, positive obligations mean that the state must put measures in place. So these measures are laws, policies, effective remedies, and they're there to safeguard people from harm or violation by others. So this could involve preventing domestic violence or protecting personal data, or maybe ensuring that victims have access to justice if their rights are breached. Here's a case that illustrates positive obligations, and it's X and Y versus Netherlands from 1985. And in this case, a young woman with intellectual disabilities was sexually assaulted. And the Dutch authorities failed to provide a way to prosecute the offender because they had a gap in their criminal law. And the court found the state had a positive obligation under Article 8 to protect her right to respect for private life by ensuring effective legal remedies. So let's just wrap up now. Article 8 is one of the most dynamic rights in the European Convention. It adapts to societal changes and new technologies. It protects a wide range of interests, from personal data and family relationships to home life and digital privacy. And its flexibility is a strength and a challenge, as courts must balance individual rights with public interests. So here's a few questions to consider. How do courts decide if a restriction is necessary? Can you think of modern examples? So, social media privacy, CCTV, surveillance. How do we balance the right to privacy with the need for public safety and national security? And finally, do you think Article 8 goes too far or not far enough in protecting individuals? So please do take a look at my other videos in which we'll discuss other articles. We're going to discuss Articles 10 and 11, and these deal with freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And these are rights that often intersect with Article 8. So take a look at those too.